All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're taking a look at a set of documents that make a pretty wild claim that they found data-driven empirical proof for religious truth. We're going to walk through their logic piece by piece and see exactly how they build this case. This quote right here is really the heart of the whole thing. It's what a data scientist apparently said after analyzing a holy book, and it completely reframes the argument. We're not talking about faith anymore. We're talking about a statistical problem that needs to be solved. So, the entire argument really rests on this one foundational claim. The source is saying that the Quran isn't just a text you're supposed to interpret, it's more like a file that can be verified. They believe it contains a built-in, statistically verifiable proof of its own divine origin. Now, the core concept here is something they call a divine checksum. If you're into computers, you'll get this right away. It's like the Quran is protected by this incredibly complex mathematical structure, kind of like a checksum in computer code that prevents a file from getting corrupted. It's a system designed to detect any error or alteration. And the key that supposedly unlocks this whole code? It's the number 19, which, interestingly, is mentioned in the text itself. They argue this is no coincidence. As you can see, major things like the number of chapters, key phrases, even the word for God are all perfect multiples of 19. That's a pattern that would be unbelievably difficult to fake or maintain over time. But it doesn't stop there. There's another layer to this alleged design. Beyond just the number 19, the text seems to perfectly balance opposing ideas. The word for man shows up exactly as many times as woman, same for life and death and angels and devils. The source argues this points to a deliberate, almost architectural design. And this is the question it all builds to, right? The patterns we've seen are complex, for sure. But this next piece of evidence, well, this is what they present as the knockout punch, a piece of information that was, simply impossible for any human to know back in the 7th century. So first, let's just look at what modern science tells us. Today, thanks to satellites and all our tech, we know the exact ratio of water to land on Earth. This is a pretty recent discovery in the grand scheme of things. Okay, now for the big reveal. The researchers went through the Quran and just counted. The word for sea appears 32 times, the word for land 13 times. When you add those up and calculate the percentages, it perfectly mirrors the geophysical composition of our planet, down to the decimal point. So what are the odds of all this? The number 19 stuff, the word balancing, the land/sea ratio. What are the odds it all happened by chance? The source uses a statistical tool called a Bayes factor, and their conclusion is that the data is 100 billion trillion times more likely if it was divinely authored than if it was human authored. I mean, that is just a staggering number. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of their argument. After laying out that data, the source introduces a whole philosophical framework, and it's basically designed to define what they see as the absolute, uncrossable boundaries of what we can ever know. They call it the ADI conjecture. The easiest way to get it is through their sandbox analogy. Picture our entire universe, everything science could ever possibly study, as being inside a sandbox. Science can measure everything in the sandbox, but it can never, ever measure what's outside the sandbox. It can't measure the creator who made it. This, they say, leads to two ways of thinking. What they call square logic is like modern physics, trying to explain our sandbox by imagining infinite other sandboxes right next to it, the multiverse. Cube logic, on the other hand, adds a third dimension, a vertical one, and argues the sandbox exists for a reason, because of a creator outside of it. All right, now we get to the third and, frankly, the most audacious claim in these documents. The source takes the very same statistical tools they used on the text and applies them to a living person to try and identify them as a prophesied leader, known as the Mahdi. To do this, they lean heavily on something called Bayesian probability. Don't worry, it sounds complicated, but the core idea is simple. It's just a mathematical way of updating your beliefs. You start with a guess, and as new evidence rolls in, you adjust how sure you are. The analogy they use makes it super clear. Think about losing your keys. The initial odds that they're in the fridge are like almost zero, right? But then you remember, oh wait, I grabbed a yogurt the second I walked in the door. Suddenly, that new piece of evidence makes the fridge a very likely spot. The odds update dramatically. So the source applies that same logic. They start with the near zero chance of any random person being this figure. Then they start layering on evidence, one cluster at a time. Things like his name and lineage, certain physical traits, the timing of his appearance. But the two pieces they give the most statistical weight to are what they call his unique intellectual contributions, coming up with the ADI framework and demonstrating that Quranic proof in the first place. And after multiplying the statistical weight of all 6 of these independent clusters of evidence, the Bayesian formula spits out this number, a base factor of 7.2 septillion. It's a number so big it's almost impossible to wrap your head around without some context. So let's get that context. In something we all understand, like a paternity test, a base factor of just 1,000 is considered virtual certainty. The number they calculated is, well, it's exponentially bigger, which leads them to conclude that this person's identity is a statistical fact, not just a belief. So this brings us to the final section, and really the big so what. If someone were to actually accept this entire chain of logic, the proof, the philosophy, the identification, what does that actually mean for us? What are the implications? The source calls this epistemological closure. It's a fancy term, but the idea is that the biggest questions, the why are we here questions, have now been answered. And if that's true, then humanity's goals should probably shift away from just endlessly discovering things and toward wisely cultivating the knowledge we now have. And this all leads to their ultimate ethical conclusion. Remember the sandbox? Because the ADI framework says our logic is fundamentally limited, we're stuck inside the box, it can't be our ultimate guide. Therefore, they argue, compassion has to be the final check and balance on any system of logic we create. And so we end with their final, really provocative question. It takes this whole argument, which is full of data and math and statistics, and turns it right back on us. If the great mysteries of the universe out there are solved, is the true final frontier of human exploration actually an internal one,